And I might add, do whatever you can to physically place yourself within the environments that these other artists you want to impress with your work are currently existing in, because I've known many people in my life that have this idea that they just do this amazing, groundbreaking stuff, and the world will literally beat a path to their door, which is absolutely a billion miles away from reality. So it is very healthy, and I think very proactive to do what you can to physically place yourself within scope of an interview or company, such as an environment such as this.
Absolutely.
Without being creepy. I mean, persistence is one thing, creepy is another, and I mean, I'm not even being silly. I've met a lot of would-be artists that creep me out too much for me to hire them.
I think we were a little creepy with Clay at first. We'd follow him around, stalk him a little bit at the cons.
Still creepy.
Look at us! We're still like, look at us!
He just hired us to make it stop. Also, I want to thank Walter O'Neill for being here, Professor Oria, and we could have gotten him on the panel as well. It's amazing work, and check his stuff out on D1 Art. It's some sick stuff.
Let me add one thing. To me, because I'm a figurative sculptor, a lot of creatures, and not all of them, so a lot of them come from the roots of animals, insects, and things like that, but a lot of creatures are anthropomorphic, which is an abstraction of the human form, so try to know your human anatomy. If the figure's what you want to do, people need to see that you know your anatomy. Human anatomy is difficult, and a lot of people, not necessarily art directors, but people can look at a piece of yours and know something's wrong, and they may not know what it is, but people know what's wrong with another sculptor or person. So study your anatomy, know your anatomy, and then see what you can do with it to make it, in the case of what I do, because I do a lot of women that are beautiful, you know, you want to do a nobility to it or start to bring your own expression to it. But remember, creatures can be an abstraction. It begins, to me, in a lot of ways, sculpture begins and ends in this industry with the human form. In other film, things like that, there may be creatures and things like that, but remember that, know your human anatomy and study it.
And your comparative anatomy, that's so true. It's a combination of human anatomy and animal anatomy. We can only draw on what we know, and what we know is all here on the earth. So it's a matter of mixing and matching any number of anatomical and design cues in nature, and managing to mix those convincingly. You know, this is like a mushroom with a humanoid face and some fish-like elements to it. You know, even some sort of shell-like attributes. You know, but the whole idea is to put all of that together in a convincing package, something that's homogenized. You know what I mean? You know.
Yeah, the parts, you don't want the parts to look like they're like glued together or anything. There has to be consistency and a flow to it. Look at these great lips on this piece. I mean, they're just very expressive, and they're very close to human lips. You know, you don't want to make the parts look like they're glued or sewed on or some sort of, you know, Frankenstein creature.
Okay, I'm ready to throw it open to questions. So, anybody have a go? Yes, ma'am.
This question is for any of you, or maybe both of us. From the perspective where you are now in your lifetime, can you look back and see where you became interested in manifesting your talent, because you obviously have talent, into sculpture rather than into two-dimensional drawing?
I go ahead, Joe.
I was weed eating. I was working on a lawn crew weed eating, and I thought, this sucks. And I thought, I'm going to sit in my lane until something happens, you know. And
we're failed. I mean, we're failed comic book artists. That's what we wanted to do. And most sculptors are badass. Most sculptors we know are badass to the artist. I mean, if you're a badass sculptor, you're a badass drawer or painter. It's not the case with us. We couldn't draw well enough to be in comics. We wanted to be in comics desperately. Well, maybe if I sculpt this Wolverine out of, you know, paper clay and coat hanger, that's sort of like drawing a comic. It's still Wolverine. And it was, when Jarrod and I started, obviously it was back in the day when there weren't a million Wolverine sculptures. So it was almost like, oh my God, look at this 3D Wolverine I just did. That's what it is. That's when it was for us. And honestly, like I say, I wanted to be an artist, but I didn't know I was a sculptor until we realized the other thing was it was a bitter failure. Anybody else? I know.
I did illustration for like 10 years before I got into sculpting, and I think literally what I got into was like, I was kind of bored of it. You know what I mean? When you get into something, oh, you know what I mean? It's like you're doing something two-dimensional so much so you're just like, can't even do anything two-dimensional.
Completely after a certain point, you really need to get to the next level.
Yeah, because you know you're finished when you're finished with a, for me, when I see a sculpture, I know when I'm done. When I see a painting, I'm like, I could have did this, I could have played with that. I suppose that's where the computer stuff comes into play. Trying to bastardize
for me, I can draw. I'm not even in the same league as Paul, but for some reason, the idea of creating and one of my idols, a guy I worked for a few times named Rick Baker, he said it very well in an interview once. He said it feels like being a god. You know, you're creating this thing that's three-dimensional. You know, and one of the things I think that's exciting about 3D, and again as opposed to the computer thing, unless you print it out, yes, in the printer, is that you are creating something that confronts the viewer in their own real space. A drawing or a painting, as magnificent as it is, isn't the same. A sculpture confronts us in the very space, the very plane in which we exist, which is that of 3 dimensions. And the idea of creating something that you could walk around, you could move around, every angle of it was rendered, is just, it's something that's endlessly fascinating to me, you know? I'm old and broken down at 42, and I still find it fascinating, like I'm 3 again, you know, well, 6.
Oh, well, I've always been sculpting and drawing, but they were two completely separate worlds for me. And I knew I could draw a certain way, and not that I knew it was really a craftsman, and I could sculpt a certain way, but it was just smushing concepts to play around. You know, I had tables full of little plasticine Godzillas, and that was the extent of it. And I had little stapled together comic books that I do, starring Ernie and Bert from Sesame Street, and various other things, and various bizarre scenarios. But it wasn't until much later, say around college, art school, that I desperately found the need to kind of meld the two disciplines, called them disciplines at the time, and be able to take an abstract idea, some completely insane thought form, and give it a three-dimensional form. And kept kind of banging my head against this kind of blockage, going, how can I do this? And finally, there was a certain point, I just began to experiment with clay, with super sculpting, and just trying to nail down, if I could draw it, could I sculpt it? And within a very short amount of time, I was able to find, and it was a profound moment in my life, and I was able to look at something and say, that's it, that's actually my idea of manifesting clay, and to be able to turn it around and see it existing in spaces Jordu has mentioned.
A very short amount of time.
Relatively so.
A very short amount of time.
Questions? Any other questions? Anybody else?